David, did you have a poem or a literary insight? Oh, there's
Yes, I
Grace.
do. Why don't I start with that? Here comes
Yeah, there's Grace.
Grace is
Okay.
here. And then I will do my poem.
Hey,
Hello,
Grace.
Grace.
Hello, I'll
Good
be right with
morning.
you. Good morning, good morning. Good afternoon here.
Right.
Okay, let us begin. My quote today is from Genesis chapter 15, verse 5, and it's going to come in a little bit handy when we talk about Genesis chapter 1 in a little bit. And it goes like this. And he brought him forth abroad and said, look now towards heaven and count the stars, if thou be able to count them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. So we're going to be doing some star counting a little later. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right. Well, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We thank God and we thank the program committee and the board of trustees for inviting us to busy ourselves with Torah. So we'll just get started, I guess, just for the small but mighty group that we have here. We're finishing the book of Deuteronomy, finishing the Torah, the fifth book of the five books of Moses, and the very last portion is called Vizot HaBracha. This is the blessing, if you will, and it marks the conclusion, or even stress it as the climax of Moses's farewell address. And traditionally, the understanding or the call it the interpretation is that Moses, of course, wrote the entire Torah except for the last few paragraphs. That God had inspired Moses. Some would say God dictated, and Moses wrote the entire Torah except for the last few paragraphs, because God was compassionate and didn't want Moses to have to write about his own death. It was difficult enough for Moses to realize he wasn't going to achieve his ultimate goal of crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land, and certainly he didn't. God didn't want Moses to have to write down that no one would ever visit his grave. So the understanding, at least traditionally, the understanding is that a later editor, or God self, himself, herself, they self, wrote down the last few paragraphs. Parallel to what Jacob had done before. Jacob, of course, is Israel. Before he died, Jacob gives a blessing to all of the tribes. Similarly, then Moses does the same and gives a special, although much more briefly, gives a blessing to each of the tribes. This is the only time in the Torah that Moses is referred to as Ish HaElohim, a man of God, if you will. And the rabbis have in the Midrash and the commentaries focus on that particular phrase as one of three phrases that I'm going to mention here. Sorry, three or four, that Ish HaElohim, the man of God. And one rabbi's comment is that Moses at this point can be compared to a dying flame of a candle. Not so much a match, but of a candle that for a moment, when it knows that it's going to be extinguished, it kind of glows a little bit brighter, a little bit larger, and then it sputters out. And so in that last moment, before his death, the rabbis say that Moses is when he finally achieved the ultimate, brightest, inspirational understanding or connection to God. Their words are that he achieved spiritual perfection, and that's why he could be referred to as Ish HaElohim, as the man of God. Ultimately, because at that moment, just like a flame that right before it dies out, it gets a little bit brighter. And some of us may have even had that experience. I know that I have, before someone dies. Sometimes they open their eyes. There's almost like you get a sense that there's a particular insight and awareness before they take their final breath. So again, that's one kind of interpretation of these last few sentences in the Torah. Another is that when in this last paragraph, or call it the eulogy, if you will, a description of Moses's death, there's the phrase "ein od." Now, some of you may remember that phrase from the liturgy, and at the end of what we sing of "ein od," that there is no one else, and the reference here is that it says that never again did a prophet arise over Israel who, like Moses, knew God face to face. There's never been anyone else like that. And the rabbis point out the only other time that particular phrase of "ein od" was used was by Moses himself when he described God that way. Okay, that describing to Pharaoh that there's and the Egyptians, there's one God, ein od, no other God, whatever. So the tradition is that God then uses the same words in tribute back to Moses in a sense of eulogy. Moses ascends Mount Nebo. And actually, the text actually doesn't say that no one knows his grave. It's that no one knows or no one witnessed God burying him there. The children of Israel mourn for Moses for 30 days, which is where we get the tradition of shloshim. So we have the three stages of mourning in Jewish tradition. There's the Shiva, there's the first 7 days, then there's the 30 days, the shloshim, and then there's the year of reciting Kaddish. And again, there's this phrase that never again did a prophet arise in Israel like Moses, except for the strongly egotistical Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, that's Maimonides or Rambam, who is certainly considered a prophet, although Maimonides never claims that he's on the same level as Moshe Rabbeinu, as Moses of the Torah. Others use the reference about him, but Maimonides or Rambam never claims it himself. On the other hand, there's a fellow by the name of Moses Isserles, whom you might or might not know the name. Isserles was the Ashkenazi rabbi based in Prague who wrote the major Ashkenazi commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, which is the Code of Jewish Law. Code of Jewish Law, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, who was leader of the Sephardic community based in Tzfat and with strong Kabbalistic mystical influence there. But he wrote Shulchan Aruch, and then Isserles wrote his commentary to add especially what the Ashkenazim do when there was differences between the Ashkenazi and Sephardi. But Moses Isserles not only claimed in his lifetime that that where he would quote that phrase, "Never again did there arise another prophet in Israel like Moses." He wrote it down. He instructed his followers to include that statement on his tombstone. So if you go to the big Jewish cemetery in Prague and you find Moses Isserles' tombstone, his grave, there's that phrase is written there, because this Moses Isserles is so great that there hadn't been anyone since Moshe Rabbeinu in the Torah, then Rambam, Moses Maimonides, then Moses Isserles in like the 1600. So anyway, that brings us with a few little insights into the conclusion of the Torah. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. Be strong, be strong. We strengthen one another as we start the Torah all over again. And I'm going to invite David to continue with some comments on Bereshit.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
I can. Yeah.
Yep.
Just seconds ago, I was able to get the speakers to work. So now I can hear you and Wendy can hear you a lot better. Excuse me. I wanted to thank Rabbi Roman for allowing me to do this, the great honor of teaching the very first portion of the year. And this is really a very exciting portion. It includes Genesis chapter 3, which is possibly the most beautifully written chapter in the entire Torah, but the entire thing is really very interesting. We're dealing with the beginning. Bereshit is Hebrew for in the beginning. It is the first word, the first words in the Torah. And chapter 1 begins, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now the earth was unformed and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." And scientists are going to be looking at this, and they have looked at this very closely, and they've been trying to interpret that chapter, "Let there be light," and there was light. Is that the creation of the universe? I believe that it is, and including the galaxies, the stars, and everything else. And God saw the light, and it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And then God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And so God made the firmament, divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters that were above the firmament, and it was so. And then on the third day, God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together under one place, and let the dry land appear. And then let the earth put forth grass, and then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven." This is the fourth day, "to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and for years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. A few minutes ago, this greater light had a total of 8 sunspots on it, and also 20 prominences going around the sun. Quite a light today. And then it's interesting, the lesser light to rule the night, which is the moon, and he made the stars also. In my translation, it says, "and the stars." In the King James Version, it says, "he made the stars also." Most rabbis interpret that as being as an afterthought, because they wanted the creation of humanity to be the absolute crowning achievement. I find it very difficult when they say in 4 words he made the stars also to be exactly what was intended. This particular human was somehow asked when he was young, just before he was even bar mitzvahed, on April the 29th, 1961. I think the rabbi might remember that day. Anyway.
Yeah, it came after the 28th.
Yes, it did. Yeah, it came after the 28th. Good for you. Anyway, at our synagogue, we did the bar mitzvahs on Shabbat morning, and so mine was the 29th. But in any event, the idea that the stars were created and that this particular human before his bar mitzvah was really given some kind of a order or an intense feeling that he was supposed to study the stars. I began to study the stars then, and I do that now today. I've never stopped it. And then we move on to chapter 2, and the heaven and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. On the 7th day, God finished his work which he has made, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work. And God blessed the 7th day and hallowed it, because that in it he rested from all his work, which God in creating had made. And in a sense, that might be considered the first of the commandments. I'm also going back into chapter 1 where it says for signs and for seasons. There's no commandment there, obviously, to study astrology, but it has been a Jewish tradition not to study it as part of prayer, for certainly not, because that would violate the first commandment, but to study it, just to enjoy it. And a lot of Jewish people enjoy astrology just for fun. And there's nothing wrong with that. What we have had, most astronomers will disagree with me, but what the astrologers have contributed in the future for their lives has been absolutely astonishing. Absolutely astonishing over the centuries. We would not be where we are now. We would not be where we are now were it not for the work of the astrologers in past centuries. And then finally, God creates Adam and Eve, and he convinces Eve, he puts them into this beautiful Garden of Eden, which is almost as pretty as the Arizona desert, but it's there, a very beautiful place. But he orders them not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then Eve starts to talk with the serpent. And in those days, serpents were a lot different from how they are now. It was after the fall that the serpent was condemned to live his or her life crawling on the ground. And so we go on. They're expelled from Eden. And I have a few thoughts about that right now, because not just in our tradition, but in Christianity, John Milton wrote about the original sin, which it is traditionally known as in Christianity. And he wrote considerably about it. When John Milton was a student at university, after he graduated, he decided to take a trip, as many young people did at the time, to the continent. He went to Italy. He wanted very much to meet Galileo. And he was advised, if you're going to meet him before you get to Rome. Because if you get to Rome, the people there will absolutely forbid you from meeting Galileo, which is what Milton did. And in Areopagitica, he writes, there it was that I found and visited the famous Galileo, grown old, a personality a prisoner of the Inquisition for thinking in astronomy otherwise than the Franciscan and Dominican licensers of thought. And very interesting how that is done. I imagine they had a very interesting conversation. Milton probably told Galileo he was getting some thoughts together to write a very long epic poem about the fall of man. It was called Paradise Lost. And in all that book, there's only one human being who is mentioned, and that is Galileo. Him the almighty power hurled headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky, as how Milton describes when Satan is thrown out of the sky. But we digress. We digress. We digress because we want to continue with our discussion of these chapters. Genesis goes on and goes on in a number of ways, all the way up to the expulsion from Eden. Then there's the birth of Cain and Abel, and what Cain did to Abel, and that lesson where God asked him, well, why did you do that to your brother? And he said, oh, I don't know. Did you kill him? He said, yeah. He said, why'd you do that? And Cain said, I'm not my brother's keeper. And that's a very important lesson in Jewish liturgy and all other things about dealing with family, no matter what they might do to us. Anyway, we come to the end. There is the lovely Haftorah, which is from Isaiah, which goes again into the creation story a little bit. But I want to end with something that I find very interesting as part of this. And that is that in the creation story, God begins by creating light, the basis of the universe. He eventually creates the stars, galaxies, the earth, the dry land, the very simple features about creation, the simple animals, the plants, and finally, he creates humanity at the very end, the crowning achievement. In the 19th century, Charles Darwin came out with a theory of evolution. And I remember that is now considered as fact. And I remember watching in 1980 Cosmos, and Carl Sagan, he had a television program of a worldwide audience of millions who listened to him talking about the origin of life. And he said several words that I've never forgotten. Evolution is a fact, not a theory. I happened to be watching it that night with a group of friends who are Jehovah's Witnesses, and they jumped out of their chairs with anger at that. They were very angry at Carl. And so I'd like to end my presentation today by talking a little bit about the Jewish attitude towards evolution. And Joseph Hertz, the late chief rabbi of the British Empire, in fact, possibly the last one, he wrote, in face of this great diversity of views as to the manner of creation, there is nothing inherently un-Jewish in the evolutionary conception of the origin of growth of forms of existence, from the simple to the complex, and from the lowest and to the highest. The biblical account gives expression to the same general truth. And even Rabbi Hertz talks about this as a fact, the truth of gradual ascent from amorphous chaos to order, from inorganic to organic, from lifeless matter to vegetable, animal, and humanity. However, Hertz says one caveat here. He insists, however, that each stage is no product of chance, but is an act of divine will, realizing the divine purpose, and receiving the seal of the divine approval. As I was doing research yesterday for this, I found several Jewish scholars who agreed with this. There is nothing unbiblical about evolution if we accept that that God had the primary role in it. Whether God said to himself, let evolution take its course the way a lot of us feel, or I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that and pay attention to every little detail, that we don't know. But I want to leave it at that and give it back to you, Rabbi Roman. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Lovely teaching, David. Can I ask a simple question? And
Certainly.
maybe it's a more complex answer, but it was prodded because you were breaking up just a little bit when you were speaking a few moments ago. So what is the simplest definition or distinction between astronomy and astrology?
The simplest division is that astronomy is the study of the universe, the one I can offer, whereas astrology is the use of the orbits and the positions of the planets, the sun and the moon, and how they influence our lives. On a personal note, I can assist that the sun, the moon, and the planets have influenced my life enormously beyond words and to ultimate levels of joy. But I do not follow astrology, as none of my astronomical friends do. But I think I was taught by the rabbi, one of the rabbis at our Shar Shemayim, was that astrology was practiced in ancient times by many Jews for fun, not for any religious reason, and that it was okay.
Right.
Now I practice astronomy for fun.
And there's obviously a connection between some of the names of the Hebrew, the names of months in Hebrew. There's the signs of the zodiac are in mosaics all through the Holy Land, et cetera, et cetera. But okay, and I just wasn't, when you were talking before, I wasn't sure if you were saying astronomy or astrology. So okay.
Yes, one thing I can also add, Rabbi, is that were it not for the work of the astrologers in ancient and medieval times, we would not have our Hubble Space Telescope today. We would not be where we are today, watching comets hit planets and doing everything else that happens. We would be nowhere near where we are now, were it not for the millennia of study about the stars for other purposes in ancient times. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right. So, as was mentioned, Bereshit was the first parsha, the first sidra of the Torah. Then, several generations later, we are introduced to Noah, Noach in Hebrew. As we were talking about it at services on Saturday morning, it's a very familiar story. So I'm just going to add a few little comments, teachings, if you will. There are two, at least at the beginning of the story, there are when we're introduced to the character of Noah, there are two phrases on which the rabbis comment the most. One is that, and we talked about this on Saturday, that Noach is described as an ish tzaddik v'tamim b'dorotav, that Noah is righteous and upright in his generations. And of course, the open-ended question is it easier or is it more difficult to be righteous when everyone else is around you is not? Do you defer to the peer pressure, or are you measured against the peer pressure? or do you still devote yourself to finding righteousness, even in the midst of evil and disruption? The other phrase is Et ha-Elohim hitalech Noach, that Noah already, that Noah walked with God. Now, the rabbis jump in here and they say the only other time that we encounter that phrase is with Abraham, 10 generations later. But the difference is that Noah is described as God chooses him, as God reaches out to him. Noah is already described as one who walks with God, or walks with an intention, a self-intention of being with God, depending on how you want to translate that. That's the Noah as we meet him. He already is described that way. In Abraham's case, God says to him, God instructs him and says, I want you to walk with me. So again, pointing out some of the differences between Noah, who's already being described as someone who was righteous, and Abraham, who was chosen to become righteous and to walk with God. Noah is singled out for helping the survival of the not only the human race, but of all the animals, let's say, for the world to survive, and thereby is used as the model for what religious groups, theologians would refer to as the universal covenant between God and all humanity and all creatures, as opposed to Abraham, who next week or in a few moments, we're going to be introduced to Abraham, who is singled out for his mission, not for all of humanity, but specifically for the chosen people and the mission that God is going to give to Abraham. So the rabbis frequently jump in right away when we're introduced to Noah and say, well, what are the major differences between Noah and Abraham? And those are some. The world, when we're introduced to Noah, the world is described as being filled with Hamas. Now, interestingly enough, that's also in the Arabic. It's one of the names for one of the terrorist organization that attacks Israel these days. But in Hebrew, and it's an acronym in Arabic, but in Hebrew, Hamas certainly means violence, means disruption, evil behavior, if you will. And as a result of that, God looks down and says that the whole world is filled with Hamas, except for Noah and those who, his family, those who have been influenced by him, whatever. So we're going to bring a flood, 150 days of rain, and then build an ark. And there's a description of what the ark is after the 150 days, and after the rains dissipate and evaporate. The ark is left at the top of Mount Ararat, and depending on which historian or geographer you want to follow, it's either in Iran or in Turkey. There are claims for both where Mount Ararat is. Noah first sends out a raven, and then eventually a dove, and the dove returns with an olive branch in its beak. And God then says, "Aha! Okay, never again will I destroy the world like this." And they establish, and he sets a rainbow in the sky to demonstrate the covenant and the promise that if human beings continue to take care of the world and continue to maintain their part of the covenant, then God will again never destroy. There's a challenge to that by some of Noah's descendants who live in Shinar, the capital of which is Babel or Bavel or Babylon. Eventually, it's what it will be called. And they want to reach up to God. They want to be like God. They have one language, and they want to be in charge of the entire world. And the story is that they build a tower to reach God. The parallel in the ancient stories, and they exist in more than just our Torah, but the parallel in the ancient stories is that once again they're challenging people. Human beings are challenging this notion of well, there's a limit to how much we should know. God had said to Adam and Eve, "Do not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil." Now the people in Shinar want to be able to reach up to heaven and be like God. So God confuses all of them, gives them different languages, so they cannot communicate properly with each other. They cannot bond together. And it's Babel, which still both in Hebrew and in English means to be very, very confused and mixed up. God does give a blessing to Noah, and it's somewhat similar to the blessing given to Adam and Eve that David had referred to it also before. Adam and Eve are commanded to subdue the world. Noah is his blessing and challenge is to have more power over the animal kingdom. Adam and Eve were commanded to live with the animals, but Noah was given the opportunity, or at least the instruction, that he and his generation could slaughter animals for food. That and that was another degree, if you will, in the development, even in the evolution of the pattern. Then there's an interesting little thing that sets the tone for what's going to happen next, which is something we see frequently in the book of Bereshit, which may have been a different narrator or a different editor as he told the stories, where it talks about, here's the genealogy, here's the list of Noah had 3 sons, Japhet, who we mentioned last on Saturday. Japhet, who according to tradition, not according to scholarship necessarily, but according to tradition, was the father of the African race. Ham becomes the father, goes to the far east, and even northeast, becomes the father of the Caucasian people, and then Shem, who becomes the father of the Shemites, the Semites, if you will, and that becomes our story, our history as Jews, as Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews. 10 generations later, we are introduced to Terach, who was the great grandson of Noah through Shem. Terach, who is the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran is the father of Abram's cousin Lot, and then Abram, who marries Sarai, and their names, whether those were actually their names or those were nicknames or just legendary characters. Avram meaning great father or father of many, and Sarai meaning my princess. So they certainly could be the names that were just generic names for the leaders of the particular tribe. For whatever reason, and we'll discuss this when we get to the next portion, but for whatever reason, they all pick up, the entire clan, they all pick up and leave the Chaldees area near the Tigris and the Euphrates. They lived in a city called Ur, which was the Mesopotamian name for what we would say if you're a Superman comic follower, which would be Metropolis. That would be the city. In Hebrew, it's Ir, but in the Sumerian languages and the Akkadian languages, it's Ur. But it's Metropolis, present-day Iraq. And they left there and went to Haran, which is a little northwest, which was in Syria. And Haran is where, as we will see, where Abram and Sarai, for whatever reason, leave that open, again, as does the narrator or the editor, that's where the message came to Abram and Sarai. So we go from the story of Noah, which was last week's portion, into this week's portion, which is Lech Lecha, a very familiar phrase of get up and go forth. Technically, it actually means go to yourself or go by yourself. And there's many interpretations psychologically and spiritually as well of what that should mean for Avram and Sarai as they go on their journey. God calls out to them. Now we're in chapter 12 of Genesis. God calls out to Avram and Sarai to leave Haran, and God promises to lead them towards the land of Canaan, the chosen land, promised land, and that land, once they occupy it, will be given to Avram and Sarai and their descendants. So they go, they follow God's command. They accept the call and the mission. They arrive in Canaan and Canaan, and soon thereafter, there's a famine in the land. So they went farther southwest. They went to Egypt. And there's a familiar story, a little bit of a troubling story, that the Pharaoh falls in love with or just desires Sarai, and Avram doesn't object, and she comes to live with the Pharaoh in the palace. And then God punishes the Pharaoh and the Egyptians with plagues. It's kind of a Vorspeise, a little hint at what's going to happen in the book of Exodus. And Pharaoh wonders what's going on. Why are we being punished here? And Sarai is returned to Avram's house. They return to Canaan, to the promised land, and Abram and Lot divide up the land to hopefully avoid further disagreements on the different sub-tribes, if you will. Lot is attacked by some of the neighboring kings, but Avram rescues him and his family and establishes treaties and alliances with some of the kings on his own. Sarai is barren at this point. She has not given birth. And in a practice that was very typical in Middle Eastern culture at the time, Sarai says to Avram, sleep with my handmaiden Hagar. She shall be to you as a wife, and hopefully she will provide you an heir, a male child who can take on leadership of the clan. After Hagar becomes pregnant, she and Sarai, their relationship falters. They become very antagonistic towards each other. And Sarai, who's still head of the household, sends Hagar away. But an angel appears to Hagar and tells her to return, that indeed she will give birth to a son. That son will be blessed, etc., etc., etc. And Ishmael becomes the son of that relationship. Ishmael, from the Hebrew Yishmael, that God has heard. God has responded to my plea, Avram being at the ripe young age of 86 when Ishmael is born. God commands Avram to circumcise himself and Ishmael on the 8th day of the boy's life as a sign of the covenant forever. We'll come back to that in a minute. And then as a final recognition of being part of the covenant. And this distinguishes a little bit and will set a pattern for the covenant between God and the Hebrews, or later on the Israelites, and even later on the Jews. And that's which didn't happen with the covenant of Noah, and that is the acceptance of a change of name, whether it's changing a name or whether it's including another name. So Avram is now, his name is changed to Abraham, and Sarai becomes Sarah, in each case adding the Hebrew letter Hey, which identifies in two ways. One, it means the. So Avram is now the great father, and Sarai is not only my princess, meaning Abram's princess, but the princess, the female leader of the clan, but also the Hebrew letter Hey stands for God's name, so that God was with each of them as they took on their new name and become part of the covenant. And that then becomes a pattern for many of the leaders, if not for even many of the Jews themselves or ourselves, of taking on or either changing your name or taking on another name. So we have our secular names, as we also have our Hebrew names, so to speak. But Jacob will have his name changed to Israel. Joshua has his name changed from Yehoshua to Hosea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a familiar pattern. Okay. So then what I like to do, we'll take a few minutes. I like to share with you some of the insights and commentary of my teacher, the late Nechama Leibovich in Jerusalem, and some of the things that she highlights in looking at the Torah portion. So the first is, why Avram and Sarai? Who are they? We don't have any description like we had for Noah when it said he was righteous in his generation, he was upright. We don't have any of that. We only know his what we would say in Yiddish, his yichus. We only know his his father and grandfather and great grandfather, great, going all the way back to Shem and then Noah. So why Abram? Why are Abram and Sarai chosen for the Lech Lecha, for the call for the mission? And on the one hand, there are those rabbis who say, well, he or they, but most of the literature is about he, must have done something to demonstrate to God that they were worthy of being chosen to be the leaders of the people. And you probably know the midrash, and it's a midrash. It's not in the text, in the Torah text at all, that Terach, Abram's father, was a maker of idols as well as a worshiper of idols, and that Avram one day, whether it was intentional or accidental, knocked over, or some of the idols were broken when he was supposed to be watching the store, so to speak. And his father Terach came back and said, "Well, what happened? What happened to the?" And Avram thinks for a minute, and then he said, "Well, the big idol over there went and smashed all the smaller idols because he really thinks that he should be in charge." And father looks at son and says, "What, are you kidding? An idol can't go and knock down or destroy these other smaller smaller images. And son looks to father and says, then why are they, why do you worship them? Why do you pay attention to them if an idol doesn't have that kind of power? And the father kicks him out of the house for being belligerent. And then God appears to Avram and Sarah and says, "You're on the right track. You're now starting to understand that idolatry is facile, is incorrect. So let me show you the way. Lech lecha, follow me to the land that I will show you. Leave your father's house, leave your land, leave your birthplace, leave everything that you believed in beforehand, and I'll take you in a new direction." So there are some rabbis who follow that kind of story, and there are others, the most important of which, of course, is Maimonides, who says, no, there was actually a process here, and that Avram, from a young age, was a very curious and inquisitive young man, intellectually pursuing, trying to find answers to what his world was all about. But Rambam Maimonides says he had neither teacher nor guide. He developed all of this on his own, and he came to the conclusion that there must be one source, one power, if you will. He didn't really use the word God in that sense, because God only referred to the idols at that point, but that Avram came to the intellectual conclusion that there is some kind of a power, some kind of a source that is the prime mover, to use the Greek phrase, the prime mover of how the world began. And David was talking before that about the creatio ad nihilo, about creation out of nothing, and starting the world and continuing through the process of evolution, whether this is all part of God's plan or whether God was involved each day, each step of the journey. And according to Maimonides, then at age 40, Avram started debating with some of the locals, and he tried to convince them to follow his way of thinking, which became monotheism, if you will. Word got to the king that Avram was challenging all of the common assumptions, and the king sought to slay him. And so Avram and his family said to his parents, he says, the king's coming after me. And so they all fled. They all left Ur, metropolis, and went to a new area to save him, if you will. So that's one comment that Nechama Leibovich starts to talk about. Why we don't really know, so we have to imagine and theorize why Avram, and then did his parents come with him, or did he convince them to leave as well, or was he rejecting his parents and God promoted him, if you will. There are 5 separate times that Avram is blessed in 5 different phrases in the opening verses of this Torah portion. And again, going back, I don't know whether David had seen this in a commentary also, but going back to the story of when God is creating the world, that there are 5 times that the word or, which is light, there are 5 times that or is used in that story. And the rabbis make a parallel that then with Avram being blessed 5 times, because he is the new light, he is the new inspiration, enlightenment, and the guide that leads us in the new world and the new relationship that will ultimately be a brit, will be a covenant. Then we question Sarah or Sarai's role in all this. I mentioned earlier that it was common practice in the Middle East at that time for Sarai, when she could not conceive and give him a male child, give him an heir, it was accepted for her to provide Hagar, the handmaid. That kind of practice even shows up in Hammurabi's code. It was a well accepted presence. But Jewish tradition is that Avram hesitated, and Sarah had to insist. And the text actually specifically says that this wasn't Avram's idea. It was Sarah's idea, that the notion of continuing on the peoplehood, even if it couldn't follow through her, but it had to follow through her husband. And the text says, and Avram listened to her. It was her idea. It was her suggestion. And he agreed, as opposed to him going to her and insisting that this was his right, this was the natural practice. The final part of Lech Lecha, of the portion, is the recognition of the commandment that male children shall be circumcised on the 8th day. And says Abraham had circumcised Ishmael and himself. We can only imagine how painful that would have been. But and throughout history, circumcision, the Brit Milah is circumcision and Brit is covenant, otherwise sometimes just known as the bris. Not only is one of the most important signs of the covenant, one of the most important mitzvot, of commandments or life sanctifying acts, in a sense of a physical manifestation of the covenant, but of having it occur on the 8th day is an extremely, in the hierarchy of mitzvot, having the circumcision on the 8th day is extremely high in that listing. So that if the 8th day is Yom Kippur, you still have the Brit Milah, you still have the circumcision on the 8th day. The only reason to postpone is if doctors or medical professionals agree that it's for the health of the infant. Some of the medical professionals in our generation are saying it's also important for the medical condition of the mother, that if the mother hasn't recuperated, and now they even include that emotionally rather than just physically or medically, that you can postpone for a few days. But having the Brit Milah traditionally throughout all of Jewish history, since the days of Avram and Hagar, having it on the 8th day is one of the absolute highest mitzvot, that it cannot be postponed except for the preservation of life. And recognizing that, I want to share and just read to you very quickly. This is the commentary of Rabbi Harvey Fields. While the promise connected to Abraham's circumcision and change of name is that he will be the father of many nations, the timing of the ceremony of Brit Milah was set at 8 days after birth. Within the Jewish community, circumcision was not done to guarantee many children, but rather as a way in which a male child would become identified publicly as a Jew. Brit Milah became a ceremony of pride, an initiation of the newborn child into the faith and community of the Jewish people. Perhaps that is why Jews have observed the Brit Milah ceremony with such care and devotion through the years, and why enemies of the Jewish people have tried to prevent its practice. Rulers who wish to destroy Jewish loyalty and put an end to Judaism very often prohibited Jews from practicing circumcision. Circumcision is a sacred lesson. It's a powerful symbol of Jewish identity. It serves as a reminder to Jews of their ethical tasks and responsibilities. It teaches us that our talents and abilities require improvement. Our defects and deficiencies should be corrected and repaired. There's this image that by removing the foreskin, we're improving the sexual ability of the individual. Just as the male baby requires the improvement of circumcision, so the world requires human beings to perfect it. Brit Milah is a sign that Jews were contracted or covenanted to God for the work of perfecting both themselves, their bodies, and the world. So those are comments about Lech Lecha, the portion in which we embark this particular week. And unless any of the four of us have further questions or whatever, that'll do it for our kind of abbreviated and delayed session. David, looks like you want to say something.
Yes, I do. I wanted to thank Rabbi Roman for this lesson today. We do this every month, and something to which I look forward very, very much. But this is special. This is the beginning of Torah. This is where it begins. Bereshit, Lech Lecha, the story of the flood. And what I have to say here is that Rabbi Roman is a teacher, and a very fine teacher. And I think I regard teachers more highly than anybody else, any other field in the world. I married one of them. Wendy was a teacher for 26 years. And teachers have done so many things, whether they be human, like Wendy and Rabbi Roman, or the earth itself. When I was a student at Acadia in geology, I was on a field trip. And while I was there, I found this rock. And it was kind of interesting because there seemed to be the mark of a little fossil on it. So I decided to keep it just for a few days. When I brought it back to the lab, they sawed it in half and they took it apart. And this is what appeared. This and this. This is either a fossil turtle or a fossil fish of some sort, but it was dated at about 500 million years old.
Wow.
During the Devonian period. How people will say, how can you follow Torah when you have something like this? And my answer to that is that this confirms Torah to me, because I don't mind about the earth and the universe being created in 6 days, the common feeling that days could be ages, they could be anything like that. They do not have anything else to say regarding time, but they actually encourage us to dig deep into our souls to understand the beauty of nature, and therein the beauty we find God, and we find Torah, and we find what we're looking for. And I wanted to say thank you.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you for the compliments. Thank you for the lovely thoughts. The rabbinic phrase is alachat kama v'chama. How much the more so when you see, that what you just showed us as an audiovisual aid, and encouraging us and inspiring us to see God's work from that many millions of years ago, or on through just the insights of today and our being together. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Grace, how are you? How's your mother?
Well, so far so good. I haven't heard anything recently. She had to get some more medical opinions, and she just has been going through quite a bit, in-home care and nursing, and she's so very independent that she doesn't want to give up that
Right.
need for help with a professional nurse's assistant coming into her home and, delegating her medication and the time of her medication. And so that's a bit rough on her. And
But there are still family members in the area, right?
yes,
Who are close to her, right?
my two nephews and
Right.
my brother are there. I offered to go out to be of some assistance, but she's just like, no, I don't want you to come out because you have a dog. And she just doesn't, my mother's brain is just not there anymore, right? Sebastian is a medical necessity for me. Even though I have these other devices that are helpful, his nose will pick it up before I'm in trouble.
Right.
I had a seizure late August because I had accidentally given myself too much insulin, and he was just panting and circling and panting, and I didn't know what it was all about. And I was watching one of the movies that had been suggested during Torah. It was on a Saturday, and I made it from here where I sit in the kitchen because I get the best internet, and to the floor. And I woke up 4 hours later, right?
Ooh.
Normally I can get around this partition here and over to my chair, my lounger, before I really pass out. But that day, it wasn't a possibility. And sometimes I just don't pay attention to his signals. I mean, he got me up 3 times last night for blood sugar issues. And, so I just struggle with helping her understand that he's a necessity for me. And
Yes.
so I just, I relinquished the idea of going out to California to be of some service to her. She has my nephew there who comes in once a week, but my nephew's husband is really the godsend. He loves hanging out with his mother-in-law, or his grandmother-in-law, I should say. And he's very attentive. He takes care of her. He goes and shops for her. He helps her move around the house. He's very sweet and very kind. So and they like to have wine together. So that's good for her.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Good to hear.
I hate to interrupt, but while we were having this lovely session, I got an email from the gal who's in charge of my Monday afternoon mahjong that she's not going to be there and her backup's not going to be there. So I guess who needs to be in charge?
Yeah, Ruth Ann.
So be in charge of something else for a
I'm in
change.
charge of something else. So I got to go, which means
Thanks,
this has
everybody.
to end. So
Thank you.
hopefully,
Thank you for asking.
Yep. We'll see you on
All right.
Saturday.
We'll see you on our Friday night or
Friday
whatever.
night.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
Friday night.
All right.
Well, I won't
Take
see
care.
you one Friday night. Okay.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank